Oh, Ndade Thabo, thanks for that. You gave us very in-depth insight into your personal account on a generational level, and you've exposed in a safe environment how, yes, you've attained certain things because of being a black male. So in talking about traditional and custom norms, and you gave reference to the whole black man thing, and I want to go back to that, and perhaps I can just direct this question to the younger of our generation. So I'm coming to you, Ntate Mbuli, and I want to ask, in your opinion, when we talk about gender roles and we talk about the traditional black man, and coming off of what Ntate Thabo has just said, I want to know from you, Ntate Mbuli, is the role of lobola, in your perspective as a 21st century person, when we speak about this hectic gender role and what it comes with, especially being a black man. In growing up, what did you learn about lobola, and what do you think about today? Lobola in terms of playing a gender role, a specific gender role, and in support or not supporting the patriarchal black man role.
Thank you for the question, Coach Lucky. I think so. I'm closer. I'd like to combine two, traditional ideas. The first one that I've been asked about is lobola, and I think tradition, culture is a very broad thing. So there are many customs that kind of feed into the same kind of structures, so there are many customs alongside lobola that feed into the traditional black man gender role, right? And one of them is ugoluga, which is going to the mountain, which I recently actually experienced for myself. At the end of my matric year, I went in Durban and I was introduced into traditional cultural manhood. And so I think...
So, sorry to interrupt you, but so you yourself have been on that journey?
Yes. So I think, and that journey is something that I don't remember a time when I thought I wasn't going, every, whether it was umkomboti at the house when I was 5, 6 years old, older men, uncles, I just knew, I knew from the time I was 6, 7, that this is something that's going to happen when you're 18 years old, and there's just no way around it. There's things that I used to hear, like uncles used to say things like "inkwenkwe yinja," which means a boy is a dog. When they would talk about when are you going to go to the mountain, because a boy is a dog. So I'll engage with you when you're a man. Once you've achieved this thing that can make you a man, then I'll engage with you. And so I think there's a lot about culture that, again, feeds into this traditional role, and it kind of, the customs bring about isolation and like a sense of strength that should be found in physical pain or withstanding physical pain. And I think, sorry, to not digress too much, let me go back to what I learned about lobola alongside learning about the rest of these cultural practices. What I've learned about lobola as a child, I was told that it shouldn't be seen as a man paying for his wife, or a man attaching monetary value, whether it's cows or computers in the modern day, to his wife. It should be seen as a combination of two families. So just for quick context, how lobola works, as I know it, is that before a man and a woman are married, the man's family, namely his uncles and his father, possibly, meet with, again, so it's a combination of the two men in the family. So the uncles of one family and the uncles of the other family meet and have a negotiation over what is going to be exchanged from the family of the husband to the family of the wife before the wedding takes place. So initially, my experience of it was that it's it's something that should combine two families, and that lobola should never really fully be paid off, you know, so that there's always that bond, that attachment between the two families that has been made by this negotiation. But I think it allows for, in the context of culture, it's very easy for it not to be taken like that, you know, because it's easy to see it as a combination of two families. But at the end of the day, in lobola conversations that I've heard of or seen, there's a lot of underlying gender roles that are put into it. You know, uncles talk about, just from the simple fact that it's just uncles, you know, negotiating the value of this woman body without her any, you know, she has no say in how she should be valued and whether or not she should be valued as if she isn't, you know, as something that should be attained in an exchange with other objects. You know, she has no engagement of that. And there's a lot of things that are discussed, you know, like how well can she cook? Like Paimo brought it up, you know, the simplest gender roles, or the gender roles that lead us to society being where it is today, are the gender roles that kind of feed into lobola in itself. So even though for many people it's seen as a combination of families, I think, and maybe my view is skewed, but I think fundamentally it is an oppressive action, because it's attaching objective value to a woman body without her autonomy on it. And it's a discussion between men, again, about a woman body, similar to the, you know, abortion discussions, other discussions.
So I'll stop you there, Ndatimbuli. I'll stop you there. And that last point that you raised, I want to bring in Ndate Rankin and ask him, from a generational gap, his view on the emasculation of men, talking about this whole Ebola issue, because your last comment, when Ndatimbuli, was, you know, you gave your thoughts and perspective on what Ebola means to you right now. So I want to ask Ndate Rankin, as an elder, previous generation, if he feels similar, if he feels different, or perhaps if I can make him feel vulnerable to say, perhaps he thought at a certain stage of his life, this is what Ebola was, and this is how it emasculated him or did not, versus how he feels today. Ndate Rankin?
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm only 52, man. The generation gap is not that big. But, let's see if we can take it from a perspective that you've given it. So there's a couple of things, and thanks, I think everybody said some amazing things. There's a couple of things that, just to add to that, and I think it'll build up to that point, that I just wanted to say from my perspective. I'd like us to look at this gender-based violence scourge that we have as a male issue. It's a man issue. It's not a race issue. We can't separate ourselves from other races and say, as blacks, we're doing it in a particular way. And if you are male, you are part of the problem. Yeah. Universally. That means if it's happening in South America, or if it's happening in Europe, or if it's happening in Zimbabwe, or if it's happening wherever it is, and in this country, regardless of color, it's a male issue. And I think that's important, because the moment we start dissecting the different components of what it's made up of and what could be the causal effect, we'll realize that we always just come back to the male issue. Can I give you an example? So we can, and I saw there's some questions being asked as to the implications of some of our traditional practices and the impact that they may have in contributing to gender-based violence. Let's remember that some of these practices that we apply here are not applied in other parts of the world, and yet there's still gender-based violence. So is the correlation that we have between cultural practices a factor or an excuse? Because the correlation of traditional factors in which we practice are open to interpretation. And the challenge that we have as human beings, and in this case, particularly male, if we were going to talk about race issues, we'd have it in a different construct. The challenge that we have as human beings is that we are open to choice. And choice is one of those things that gives us the ability to interpret things the way we want to interpret. There's a classical saying going on at the present moment that I always use, is that in this scourge that we're having with this pandemic, we're all in the same boat, but we're not all experiencing the same seas. That's because people have different perspectives in terms of how they're responding and reacting to the pandemic of corona at the present moment. There was also another interesting statement that was made the other day, which talks about this element of interpretation, which was that great company or bad companies fail in times of crisis. Good companies survive in times of crisis, and great companies thrive in times of crisis. So the construct I'm trying to bring here is this element of choice. How do you choose to view a situation? And as men, we need to start asking ourselves, how are we choosing to view certain situations? And I think the aspect of culture has an interpretation to it. And what we've done as men is decided to use the interpretation to enhance a basic behavior that we've continuously and perpetually created a habit out of, and are now using that as an excuse. I think ultimately at the end of the day, as men, we need to stare at ourselves and ask ourselves the question, what behaviors are we tolerating that impact gender, particularly as we talk in this case, women? What behaviors are we tolerating? What behaviors are we practicing? And it's not big things. We don't have to go out and look at it and say, well, you know, I never laid a hand on a woman, therefore this is not, you know, I'm excluded from the conversation. But I'll tell you about the jokes that you crack, or the jokes that spread among social media, and the things that we pass, the pictures that we send to each other, the things that we do as men that talk to the behavior and the construct in terms of how we see this element that Dabo talked about in terms of respecting the other group of people. So we as men have begun to tolerate certain behaviors as part of our norm. And then on top of that, began to use excuses to justify those things. And one of them is this construct that when we construct lobola, we are buying a woman. Lobola has never been about buying women. It's never been about that. The other day I was like, so just one more thing I just wanted to add here. The other day I was saying to, somebody asked me, why do I close the door and open the door for my wife every day? When she gets into the car, when she gets into a house, etc., etc. And then initially the answer was, it was out of respect. But then when I started studying the construct of why men open doors, first, it wasn't about respect, it was about protecting. That you enter vulnerable positions first as a man in order to protect. So when you start looking at the construct of interpretation, it's very, very important to understand what have we accepted as behavioral norms, what are we beginning to use as excuses to justify our behaviors and continue to enhance that, and what are we tolerating as men with each other as things that disrespect the other gender.
Mr. Nyembe, I want to bring you in here, and you know, I want to thank Mr. Nathan Pillay. He's just sent us a question on our comment line, and I invite everybody to please join us once again. And I also remind everybody that this is a very open and a vulnerable space, that my panelists are here to be vulnerable in a safe space. So please take this into consideration. But taking nothing away, Mr. Nathan Pillay asked the question about how do we change that culture? And I want to come to you, Mr. Nyembe. In your opinion, and in understanding what Ndate Rankin has just said, we spoke lobola, Mr. Mbuli spoke about it, about his journey into manhood, what lobola means to him. Ndate Rankin spoke about the two different perspectives of his experience. So how do we change it? In your opinion, Ndate Nyembe, well, look, I'm looking at you today and I'm saying, let's change it if we can. In your opinion, where does it start? How do we change the culture?
So, thank you, Chair. In terms of changing the culture, I would say it always starts in the grassroots. And Bob Rankin said it earlier of saying it's the way you talk to each other, where it's the memes you send to each other, it's the jokes you crack. And I would go from my experience. So being a private school boy, Mr. Mbuli can also understand this. Being a private school boy of an all-boys school, we look back to ourselves in our grade 8, grade 9, grade 10 area. And we look back to this obsession of the black boy to fit into and assimilate to this lifestyle that a white man lives. So thus, many a time a black boy will fall into allowing ourselves to disrespect black women and allowing ourselves to disrespect women all in general, all encompassing. And one thing I noticed with my younger brother he's in matric currently. One thing I noticed that when you start getting to grade 11, grade 12, you only really start realizing some of the things you used to say. For example, the most common, when you used to come out of a test in grade 8, grade 9, you would say that test raped, not understanding the connotations behind it, not understanding what that would mean if you had to say in a different space. The way we even dress women, we don't call them girls and women, we say huns, we say huns, short for honeys, we say bints, we say birds, we use all these other connotations besides women, and we pull down women further and further, not realizing what we do. And then only when we get older, we feel as if, oh my gosh, like this whole epiphany came over. It's like, oh, I was actually a misogynist for a good 4 or 5 years of my life because I want to fit in and be popular with my friends and all these things. And you think, wow, now that I've made a change, I'm sure something's going to change. But then when I look at my little cousins who are still in boys' school, for example, I'll be honest and say very little has changed because the culture within those core spaces and those elite groups of patriarchies, similar to the same way we talk about when we speak about culture, saying that we hold ourselves so close to each other, the Xhosa, the Zulus, all of us as men, we sit down and have these boys clubs, we have these men's conversations that women will never enter. And in these men's conversations, we say such problematic things that we only realize at a later stage, or we'll have this conversation when we're not surrounded by another people, but we'll rather protect ourselves than question it. So to elaborate on what I just said, rather when we're in a situation of 10 guys who are saying problematic things, many a time we'll think about ourselves and think, if I start saying, and I start opposing these gentlemen, and I start questioning on why, and you feel as if, oh, I'm going to become preachy, oh, I'm going to be this, I'm going to have judgment, this, and you have all these perceptions, but then we'll be the same ones in these conversations saying that we want to see a change, but we excuse behavior because, oh, it's this uncle that I know, or oh, it's this and this and this, and to change the culture, we have to step out of our comfort zones. Because us as men, as Bob Mashalonga said earlier, he said, us as men, we are in a position of power. In this patriarchy, we're sitting now knowing that we can go into a space and hear a sexist and misogynistic joke and do nothing, and it won't affect us. We can go into a space and do something that we know is wrong, and we know no one will see it, and we will not be affected. We might be affected emotionally and so on and so on, but we perpetuate that culture because we're scared to change many a time because it puts us at risk. And that's how I feel as if we can change the culture.
So what I hear you saying, Ndade Nyembe, you spoke a lot about school and upbringing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're alluding to the fact of this typical boys' school environment where men are nurtured, bloody blah, bloody blah, and that has a big, big influence. But now I want to come to Ntate Thabo and say, in the context of the example that Ntate Nyembe just gave us, when Ntate Thabo, has, in your experience, have you ever found yourself in a situation where being a woman, you've looked at the situation and said being a woman would be easier than being a man right now?
No. Well, once. I'm in the construction industry, and we once had a project. I live in Cape Town, and we were doing a project on a factory floor, and the factory was full of women. And as I walked down through this factory floor with hundreds and hundreds of women, I've never felt so stripped of dignity in my life. You know, I understood then what women go through on a daily basis just walking down the road. You know, the things that I was called, you know, the smacking of the lips, the cat calls, the whistling. I've never felt so naked. And at that time I felt, you know, I wouldn't have minded being a woman in that particular time. But I do agree that we cannot, I do agree about the whole boys club thing. You know, the mob mentality that gives people the comfort to harass women sexually, verbally, humiliate women in public, and the self-congratulatory air that people dish out to each other as if now they're more of a man because in the company of their friends, they shouted out, "Hello, nice," or whatever the case may be. I watched a very important show called Just Men. And I recommend everybody here just try and get hold of it if you can. #JustMen, with my son, who was 14 at the time. And it was a very hard-hitting, soul-searching, reflective play that was at the Baxter at the time. And afterwards, my son asked me the exact same question: have you ever done any of these things that these men were talking about? Have you been in an environment where you tried to get a woman drunk so that you could have your way? Have you been in an environment where you witnessed a woman being beaten up and did nothing? Have you been in an environment? And so it went on, a 14-year-old son, and I had a choice to make to actually start an authentic conversation or cover up. And the tendency is to want to cover up because you want the respect. You want to be looked up to in a positive light. But the reality is different. Because I was at university when R. Kelly was singing, "You Must Be Used to Me," what was it? Paying. "I'm effing you tonight," you know? And we used to sing that at the top of our lungs. Because we had that culture, that sense of entitlement, that if you're paying for a woman, there needs to be some feedback, you know? So these are the kinds of entrenched attitudes that we have to confront. 2 days later, I was driving with him in a car, and we were driving behind a bakkie full of men. And this schoolgirl, dressed in her school uniform, was waiting to cross the road. And these guys saw her, and I could exactly see what was going to happen. They started pointing, and I knew they were just going to start shouting the usual obscenities at her. And my son and I just watched this thing, and we had resolved to speak up. And so we started blowing the hooter and shouting and pointing like madmen. And these guys were shocked. You know, they looked like they were about to climb out of the car to come and teach us a lesson. But they didn't because they were shocked. And in that moment, that high school girl escaped, and the attention was off her. And so we have to keep doing these kinds of things, not for ourselves, but for the 14-year-old, the 16-year-old, the grade 10s that have just been spoken about. Yeah.
So, Ms. Mbuli, I'm coming back to you, and I'm going to pick on you, unfortunately, because I know your high schooling career, being at one of the top boys' schools in the country. I want to take Ndade Tabo's point, and previous to that, Paema's point of this masculine community that we are built in, essentially. So I want to ask you, Ms. Mbuli, in your experience, in the context and in the environment that you were brought up in, particularly in a schooling environment. You know, we talk about this boys culture at your high school. What is a real man? If we put it in inverted commas, what did you assimilate? What did you learn? What did you come to the conclusion is a real man? And I would like to ask a further question in terms of saying what you knew was a real man and what you know now. Are those different? And if they are different, how so?
I think, okay, so going to St. John's, where I met Coach Lucky, and that's why I thought it might be confusing for most people why I'm calling him coach and nobody else is. It's because he was a coach at St. John's while I was a student there. So being at an all-boys school from when I was 6 years old, there was certain, like we've been speaking about, like it's been brought up, gender roles were, you know, laid in front of you, and engaging, assimilating, leaning into those was met with reward. You know, being even all the way up to high school. In high school, every home rugby game was watched by the entire high school. So, you know, and not just watched. I was a walk leader in matric, and you know, so that was a role that I took on and I loved doing. But when I thought about what being a walk leader actually meant, fundamentally, you know, I did a lot of yelling and a lot of, you know, screaming at 700 boys to you know, cheer and chant and, you know, cheer on 15 of these masculine, you know, hyper males, you know, super men that are running around playing this violent, aggressive sport that we should all praise, you know? And I mean, being able to be good at something is fantastic. And St. John's liked to pride itself on, you know, exposing boys to lots of things. So boys could find value in music, boys could find value in drama. And I was also able to do that at St. John's. But there was a difference, you know, there was a difference between leaning into other things and being successful at other things, and leaning into the hyper masculine actions and leaning into being a superman, you know, a man that can be great at rugby, you know. So that's what I learned. Those are the guys that I grew up looking to. In grade 8, the first 15 rugby side were the idols of high school. You know, they were the guys. They walked around and did what they want, and you know, and they were also sorry, I just need to close this little pop-up that's happened here. So
sorry for interrupting your social life there with the pop-ups.
No, it's okay, Coach. It's often because in the private school system, there's school prefects. You know, there's a head boy, deputy head boy, and head of houses. Often the heads of houses and the head boys were also the world-class sportsmen, you know, the brilliant sportsmen, the athletes, the hyper-masculine men. So what I began to learn as a young 14, 15-year-old boy was that was the link, you know, that was the ideal man. Was the leadership also was something that was touched on a lot in high school. So that's what I learned that leadership looked like. You know, leadership looked like a 6-foot masculine rugby player who can, you know, who is the desire of all the girls because he's chiseled, he's this, he's that. And even at St. John's, that discussion of hypermasculinity and masculine figures even went all the way down to, there's a statue in St. John's in David Quad of David from the Bible, and there's the head of Goliath is at his feet. So people at St. John's, when we started trying to have, when discussions about masculine roles were brought to the forefront, people would speak about David and the way David is sculpted. David is really chiseled. So, and you know, he's got this, his abs are distinct. He's standing there and David Quad is something that's spoken about at St. John's from when you are, you know, a young boy. And a lot of boys, when we were having these discussions, a lot of guys didn't understand, like, you know, what's upsetting about David, you know, like it's nice to have abs, you know, why can't David have abs? But the thing is, it's that subtle kind of seeing the rugby players as the school prefects, as the leadership, you know, leadership should be loud. Leadership should be taking up space. As a man, also because, you know, men can be loud. It's often, and when we're in group mentalities, when we're chanting, when we're doing war cries, and Dade Tabo brought up that mob mentality, and mob mentality is fostered. There's no two ways about it. It is fostered in boys' private schools and boys' high schools in general. It's built, it is encouraged. You feel safe in that mob mentality, and you just begin to take up space, be loud, and that taking up space and being loud then leads to violation, leads to not taking no for an answer, leads to, you know, all these kinds of follow-ons that are taught by the fact that leadership should be loud, leadership should be abrasive, you know, men should be brave. And sorry, a thing about that is kind of the juxtaposition. A little video that I saw, sorry to ramble, I saw a video of Ronaldo on the floor, Cristiano Ronaldo, crying after he lost, you know, and kind of this outpour of emotion is encouraged as men, but discouraged for women. And this is a clear example. So when Ronaldo was sitting on the floor crying after losing a football game, the response from social media was, wow, what an athlete, so passionate, you know, where he is at his age, he still cares so much about winning, you know. So that outburst of emotion, that taking up space, that being loud, it's encouraged as a man. But when Serena Williams, you know, it has one, you know, raises her voice once at an umpire, women are emotional, women are, you know. So that's, to answer Coach Lucky's question, that's what I learned that leadership was in high school. And I mean, you know, it's one thing seeing it, but it's also, I don't want to detach myself and say, oh, you know, I was in this boys' private school, so I was forced to see this. You know, I enjoyed it. But I mean, I felt safe in kind of the mob mentality. I played into that, you know. So I'm not an innocent, you know, boy that was, you know, coerced into seeing this world. This is the world that was around me, and it felt like this was the world I should engage with. And then towards the end of high school, when I started engaging with dramatic practices and expressing oneself, I started trying to unlearn some of these things that were put in front of me.
So